History is often written by the victors, and sometimes by the survivors. Tonight, we tell the story of a man who was neither. He believed that history had laws, as cold and unforgiving as gravity, and that those who understood them were justified in bending the world to their will. His name was Leon Trotsky. To his followers, he was a revolutionary intellect without equal, the sharpest mind of the Russian Revolution, the true successor to Lenin. To his enemies, he was a fanatic with ink-stained hands and blood on his conscience. From chaos and collapse, Trotsky built an army where none existed. He forged the Red Army from frightened peasants and shattered deserters, commanding it across frozen plains and burning cities. Against 14 foreign powers and countless internal enemies, that army prevailed. By his late 30s, Trotsky stood at the summit of power, second only to Lenin himself. And then, almost overnight, everything unraveled. By 50, he was a fugitive crossing borders and oceans. His children were dead or broken. His allies disappeared into prisons and labor camps. The man he once mocked as a dull bureaucrat, Joseph Stalin, had outmaneuvered him completely. Exiled, hunted, and erased, Trotsky watched as his name vanished from photographs, from textbooks, from memory itself. Yet, from a guarded villa in Mexico City, he continued to write, convinced that history, in the end, would remember him kindly. It did not give him the chance. Before we begin, I invite you to decide for yourself. Was Leon Trotsky a tragic idealist destroyed by betrayal? Or a dangerous ideologue consumed by the very revolution he unleashed? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if Echoes of Greatness helps you unwind and drift into the past, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this quiet corner of history reach others. Now, settle in. This is the bedtime biography of Leon Trotsky, the revolution's architect who became its ghost. Chapter 1. The Steppe and the First Restlessness. How does a revolutionary begin? Later generations look for dramatic origins, cruelty, poverty, injustice witnessed too young. But the beginning of Leon Trotsky is quieter, almost accidental, shaped less by trauma than by tension. He was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein on November 7th, 1879, October 26th in the old calendar, on a remote farm called Yanovka, set deep in the southern Ukrainian steppe. The land was wide, flat, and indifferent, a place where wealth was measured in harvests and endurance, not ideas. His father, David Leontievich Bronstein, had risen from nothing. Illiterate, unsentimental, relentlessly practical. He could not read a book, but could calculate profits in his head with ruthless precision. He drove himself and his workers through exhausting days, building prosperity grain by grain. For him, life was labor, and labor was survival. His mother, Anna, belonged to another world entirely. Educated, introspective, fond of literature, she read Russian novels by lamplight and quietly maintained Jewish traditions her husband dismissed as useless ritual. Between them stood their son, absorbing discipline from one parent, imagination from the other. Yanovka was not peaceful. Lev watched his father bargain with impoverished Polish landowners, saw seasonal laborers strike for wages, saw hunger leave men stumbling half-blind across the fields. These scenes did not yet form beliefs, but they left impressions. At 7, he was sent to a nearby Jewish religious school. He spoke no Yiddish, understood little, and felt humiliated. Within months, he was brought home. Formal faith repelled him. Authority already felt suffocating. His real awakening came later, in Odessa, the bustling Black Sea port where his cousins, the Spencers, lived. Odessa was everything Yanovka was not. Cosmopolitan, noisy, alive with debate. In their apartment, journalists argued over tea, manuscripts piled up on tables, and the smell of fresh ink lingered in the air. Here, Lev discovered literature. He devoured Pushkin, wept over Dickens, and secretly read banned works by Tolstoy. The shy farm boy sharpened himself into something harder, brighter. At St. Paul's Realschule, a mixed German school, he excelled instantly, not from humility or curiosity, but from a burning need to dominate intellectually. He needed to win, to be right, to stand above. Politics, at this stage, still meant nothing to him. The revolutionary movement lay underground after the Tsar's assassination. Liberalism felt timid. Religion felt hollow. What drove young Bronstein was something more personal and more dangerous. The conviction that intellect was power, and that one day it would have to prove itself against the world. The spark had not yet found its cause, but it was already burning.
Chapter 2. In Search of an Ideal. In 1896, Lev Bronstein was 17 years old when he arrived in Nikolaev, a quiet provincial town where time seemed to move at the pace of the weekly cattle market. For a young man sharpened by books and argument, it felt suffocating, and yet it was here that his life quietly turned. He boarded with a family whose sons flirted with socialist ideas. At first, Bronstein met them with disdain. He argued fiercely in defense of order and tradition, deploying the confident certainties of youth. Society, he insisted, followed fixed laws. Human nature did not change. Inequality was inevitable. He argued not to persuade, but to dominate, circling his opponents, testing their weaknesses, enjoying the contest. But the arguments followed him into the night. The socialist critique returned again and again, not as slogans, but as logic. It explained contradictions he could no longer ignore. Then, abruptly, his resistance collapsed. Almost overnight, the skeptic became a believer. The young man who had mocked radicalism now embraced it with an intensity that startled his companions. Bronstein soon found his way to a small discussion circle organized by Franz Fiergowski, a Czech gardener whose modest cottage stood in an orchard outside town. Police reports later described it as a nest of dangerous revolutionaries. In reality, it was a handful of young people drinking tea and debating the future of Russia. There he met Alexandra Sokolovskaya, disciplined, precise, and unwavering. A committed Marxist, she embodied everything Bronstein resisted. He gravitated toward populist ideas that celebrated heroic individuals and the moral purity of the peasantry. Marxism to him felt cold and mechanical, reducing human passion to economics. Night after night, they argued across a scarred wooden table. Their disputes were philosophical, but the tension ran deeper. On New Year's Eve, after hours of relentless debate, Bronstein exploded, denouncing Marxism as a doctrine that drained life of warmth and humanity. Alexandra left soon after, vowing never to speak to him again. Yet the argument had unsettled him. In secret, he began reading Marx, discovering in those dense pages answers to questions he had not known how to ask. By 1897, Bronstein was no longer a student of ideas, but an organizer. With friends, he founded the South Russian Workers' Union, writing leaflets, teaching literacy, and organizing meetings in cramped apartments. The movement grew rapidly, and predictably, it was crushed. In January 1898, the arrests began. Bronstein entered prison, then exile, carrying with him an idea that would no longer let him go. The search was over. The commitment had begun. Chapter 3. At the Door of History. Siberia was meant to silence revolutionaries. Instead, it educated them. For Leon Trotsky, exile became a strange kind of university. In the remote Siberian settlements to which he was sent after his arrest, time moved slowly, but ideas did not. In cramped rooms and drafty huts, he read obsessively, Marx above all, brushing away insects, cold, and exhaustion. What the Tsarist state intended as punishment became preparation. In the village of Ust-Kut and later Verkholensk, Trotsky began to write seriously. His essays on daily life in exile, sharp, vivid, unsentimental, circulated through underground networks. They reached not only Russia's scattered revolutionaries, but émigré circles abroad. A young exile from the steppe was becoming a voice. It was here that his thinking hardened. Trotsky moved decisively toward Marxism, not as moral protest, but as historical science. He argued that revolution required discipline, coordination, and a centralized party capable of acting as one. These ideas, still forming, would soon echo powerfully in debates that defined the movement. But exile could not contain him. His ambition outpaced the frozen landscape. In 1902, with the quiet consent of his wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, Trotsky made his decision. She urged him to go, to leave her and their two small daughters behind and return to the struggle. It was a sacrifice that would mark them both forever. That summer night, he escaped Siberia, hidden in a peasant cart, carrying illegal literature and forged papers. When asked for a name to place on his passport, he chose one at random. Trotsky, borrowed from a former jailer in Odessa. The irony pleased him. He would carry the mark of imprisonment into freedom. Through a web of safe houses and whispered instructions, Trotsky moved west. In Samara, word reached him. Lenin wanted him in London. There, a small circle of Russian Marxists, Plekhanov, Zasulich, Axelrod, and the younger Lenin, were building something new around the newspaper, Iskra. They needed writers who could clarify ideas and ignite conviction. One October morning, Trotsky knocked on the door of a modest London flat, a moment he would later describe as standing at the door of history. Nadyezhda Krupskaya opened it with a smile and announced his arrival. Lenin, still in bed, immediately called him in. They talked for hours about Russia, about revolution, about the party yet to be built. Lenin was impressed. Others were cautious. Plekhanov, in particular, sensed a rival behind the brilliance. Trotsky was soon working relentlessly, writing, lecturing, traveling across Europe, speaking wherever Russian exiles gathered. His reputation grew quickly. By 23, he was already being called the young eagle of the revolution. He could not yet see what lay ahead: the bitter splits, the lifelong rivalries, the coming storms.
For now, there was only momentum, purpose, and the quiet certainty that history itself was gathering speed. Chapter 4. The Schism of 1903. In the summer of 1903, the Russian revolutionary movement gathered with a single hope: unity. What it achieved instead was a fracture that would shape the 20th century. The Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party opened in Brussels, then quietly relocated to London when Belgian authorities grew uneasy. Delegates arrived carrying false papers, coded addresses, and expectations that the long-scattered movement would finally speak with one voice. Leon Trotsky came as a delegate of the Siberian organizations, confident that the Iskra Circle, the core of the party abroad, would act together. In the early sessions, he stood firmly beside Lenin. He attacked the Jewish Bund for demanding national autonomy, dismissed the economists for their cautious reformism, and argued for strict party discipline. At times, his language was harsher than Lenin's, speaking of leadership's necessary distrust toward its own members. But the true conflict unfolded beyond the podium. Lenin proposed reducing Iskra's editorial board from 6 members to 3: himself, Martov, and Plekhanov. Veterans such as Zazulich and Axelrod, revered figures of the movement, would be removed. When Trotsky learned of the plan, he recoiled. To him, it felt like betrayal, not strategy, but moral rupture. These were the pioneers who had sustained the movement through decades of exile and failure. That personal shock ignited the larger ideological clash. The battle centered on a single sentence in the party statutes. Lenin insisted that a party member must actively belong to a party organization. Martov argued that regular cooperation under party direction was sufficient. The difference appeared minor, almost technical. In reality, it concealed 2 visions of revolution. Lenin imagined a tightly disciplined core of professional revolutionaries. Martov envisioned a broader movement, rooted in sympathy and participation. Trotsky aligned himself passionately with Martov. Lenin, he warned, was not building a workers' party, but an intellectual command structure that would substitute itself for the working class. The Congress dissolved into chaos. Delegates shouted, alliances collapsed, friendships shattered. When the Bund and the economists walked out, the balance shifted. Lenin's faction suddenly held the majority, the Bolsheviks. Martov's became the Mensheviks. The names would endure, even when reality reversed them. The Congress closed in bitterness. Trotsky emerged as one of Lenin's fiercest critics, denouncing what he saw as authoritarian ambition. For the next 14 years, he would wage intellectual war against Bolshevism, warning that centralized power would eventually replace the will of the masses. His warning was prophetic, though not in the way he imagined. In 1917, Trotsky would join the Bolsheviks and stand beside Lenin in revolution. History, it seems, often reserves its sharpest ironies for those who understand it too early. Chapter 5. 1905. The Dress Rehearsal. When revolution came to Russia in 1905, Leon Trotsky was still an exile, drifting between cafes in Geneva, living out of boarding houses, watching his homeland from a distance. Then came the news from St. Petersburg. On a cold January day, a priest named Father Gapon led unarmed workers toward the Winter Palace. They carried icons, petitions, and hope. They met rifle fire. Trotsky understood immediately that something irreversible had begun. This was not a strike or a petition. It was a rupture, the first crack in an ancient order. By February, he was back in Russia, crossing borders with forged papers and borrowed names. He entered a country vibrating with unrest. Factories shut down one after another. Students transformed lecture halls into assemblies. Even the cautious zemstvas, councils of landowners, spoke openly of constitutional limits on the Tsar's power.
For months, liberal voices appeared to set the pace of events. But Trotsky, writing feverishly from hiding, saw what others refused to admit. Russia's bourgeoisie was too weak, too entangled with foreign capital and aristocratic land ownership to lead a true revolution. They wanted reform without risk, order without transformation. Trotsky argued something far more radical. The working class, tiny in number but concentrated and organized, would have to lead. History, he believed, had assigned them an impossible task, and impossibilities were precisely where revolutions were born. In October, a printers' strike in Moscow spread outward to railways, factories, and cities, until the empire itself stalled. The Tsar, shaken, issued the October Manifesto, promising civil liberties and an elected assembly. At the same moment, something unprecedented emerged in St. Petersburg. Delegates from factories gathered and formed the Soviet of Workers' Deputies, an elected council meant to coordinate the strike. Trotsky arrived as the Soviet was finding its voice. He was only 26, younger than most of the delegates, but possessed a rare gift: the ability to turn confusion into clarity. He wrote its proclamations, drafted its appeals, and spoke with a calm authority that gave shape to collective anger. Though claimed by rival factions, he joined none. His loyalty, he insisted, was to the revolution alone. Within weeks, he was elected chairman. For 50 days, the Soviet stood as a rival center of power. It issued decrees, organized militias, enforced an 8-hour workday through collective action. Ministers watched, uncertain whether to negotiate or crush this embryonic government. Trotsky knew time was against them. The revolution needed allies. In the army, in the provinces, beyond Russia itself. But momentum slowed. Liberals retreated. The state recovered its nerve. In December, the authorities struck. The Soviets' leadership was arrested en masse.
At his trial, Trotsky transformed the courtroom into a stage, declaring that the revolution had been defeated, but not destroyed. Sentenced to exile once more, he escaped yet again, this time across the frozen north by reindeer sleigh. The revolution of 1905 had failed, but it had revealed something decisive. For 50 days, workers had governed themselves. They had created the form, the Soviet, that would return 12 years later to finish what had begun. The rehearsal was over. The performance awaited its moment. Chapter 6: Permanent Revolution and the Years of Waiting. After his escape from Siberia in 1907, Leon Trotsky settled in Vienna, a city of cafes, opera houses, and imperial calm. For nearly 7 years, it was his base of exile, a period he later described as the long pause of reaction. The revolutionary wave of 1905 had receded, and Russia sank back into repression. Prisons filled, gallows worked steadily. The movement that had once surged forward now survived only in fragments. From a modest apartment near Schönbrunn Palace, Trotsky tried to hold those fragments together with words alone. He refused to join either the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks, convinced that the split of 1903 was a tragic mistake that history would soon correct. His newspaper, Pravda, printed cheaply and smuggled into Russia in false-bottomed suitcases, called relentlessly for unity. Lenin had no patience for this. He dismissed Trotsky as a meddler, a man without discipline who disrupted the hard work of building a party. Trotsky, in return, saw Lenin as a narrow sectarian, more interested in commanding a loyal corps than leading a broad revolutionary movement. The break between them hardened. Yet these years of political isolation were also years of intense intellectual clarity. Trotsky refined the theory that had first emerged in 1905: permanent revolution. Russia's working class, he argued, would be forced to lead the democratic revolution because no other class could. Once in power, it could not stop at democratic reforms. Economic reality would push it toward socialist measures. But Russia, backward and isolated, could not complete this transformation alone. The revolution would have to spread to the advanced countries of Europe, or be crushed. Vienna's Central Café became his informal office. There he debated with Austro-Marxists like Victor Adler, Otto Bauer, and Karl Renner, formidable thinkers who analyzed nationalism and empire with precision, even as the world around them slowly unraveled. Trotsky admired their learning, but recoiled from their caution. To him, they had turned Marxism into scholarship, and revolution into theory. He absorbed European culture deeply, attending operas, studying art, reading philosophy and literature. This exposure sharpened his intellect, but widened the distance between him and the underground activists inside Russia. He saw backwardness not as a virtue to be celebrated, but as an obstacle to be overcome. In 1912, he published a searing analysis of the Russian intelligentsia, intellectuals suspended between classes, speaking for forces that barely existed. Their brilliance, he argued, bred extremism and isolation. They were leaders without followers, visionaries without power. He was, unknowingly, describing himself. By 1914, Trotsky was famous across European socialism. A celebrated journalist, a compelling speaker, a theorist of uncommon range. But he led no party, commanded no organization. He was a voice, influential, persuasive, and alone. When war erupted across Europe that summer, shattering the world of Viennese cafes and international congresses, Trotsky would learn a hard lesson. Ideas, no matter how precise, were not enough. Revolution required preparation, the kind Lenin had been building patiently, while Trotsky waited for history to catch up with him. Chapter 7: War and the Collapse of the International. In August 1914, the war arrived like a thunderclap, and with it, the sudden collapse of European socialism. Parties that had sworn to oppose imperialist slaughter folded within days. In Germany, Social Democrats voted for war credits. In France, socialist leaders wrapped themselves in the national flag. The Second International, once a symbol of working-class solidarity across borders, disintegrated almost overnight. Trotsky witnessed this betrayal from Vienna, and it shook him deeply. The moral ground beneath socialism had given way. As a Russian citizen in enemy territory, he was declared an enemy alien and forced to flee. Carrying little more than his notebooks and manuscripts, he crossed into neutral Switzerland, a country suddenly crowded with exiles, deserters, and broken ideals. There, he wrote one of his most searing works, War and the International. It was not a calm analysis, but an indictment. The German Social Democratic Party, he wrote, had been the teacher of generations of Russian revolutionaries, and now it had sent workers to kill workers in the name of the Kaiser. The war, Trotsky argued, was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was capitalism tearing itself apart, its economic forces straining against the limits of the nation-state. Only revolution, not peace conferences or diplomacy, could bring it to an end. By late 1914, Trotsky moved to Paris, where the atmosphere was tense and suspicious. There, he reunited politically with Julius Martov, his longtime rival, now an ally in opposition to the war. Together, they edited Naše Slovo, Our Word, a fragile daily paper, often no more than 4 pages long. Despite its size, it became a crucial voice for Russian internationalists who refused to side with any of the warring empires. Trotsky was attacked from all directions. German courts condemned him in absentia for insulting the Kaiser. French authorities accused him of serving German interests. To each nation at war, an internationalist was by definition a traitor. Trotsky belonged nowhere, except to a future that had not yet arrived. That future flickered briefly into view in September 1915 in the quiet Swiss village of Zimmerwald. 38 socialist delegates, traveling discreetly, gathered in secrecy. They could fit into just a few train carriages, all that remained of the international socialist movement. Trotsky was asked to draft the manifesto. It had to balance revolutionaries and pacifists, radicals and cautious reformers. The language was restrained, but its spirit was unmistakable. Across borders, across trenches and ruins, it ended with the old call, "Workers of the world, unite." The war, however, tightened its grip. In 1916, the French government lost patience. Under pressure from the Tsarist embassy and its own police, Trotsky was ordered to leave the country within 24 hours.
Spain detained him briefly in a confused, almost absurd imprisonment. Guards unsure whether they were watching a dangerous revolutionary or a foreign journalist of some importance. Eventually, in early 1917, he sailed for New York. For 10 weeks, Trotsky lived in the Bronx, riding the subway each day to the offices of Novy Mir, New World, a Russian-language socialist newspaper. He worked alongside figures like Nikolai Bukharin and Alexandra Kollontai, analyzing American capitalism, while his thoughts remained fixed on Europe. New York fascinated him. Its scale, its energy, its towering skyscrapers, a glimpse of a future shaped by industry and contradiction. Then, in a cramped print shop on the Lower East Side, amid the smell of ink and the rhythmic pounding of presses, a telegram arrived. Revolution in Petrograd. The Tsar had abdicated. The old regime had fallen. Trotsky booked passage at once, but history, once again, delayed him. The British intercepted his ship at Halifax, fearing the arrival of a dangerous agitator. He was interned for a month in a prisoner of war camp, watched, questioned, and restrained. Only when the Petrograd Soviet demanded his release did the gates open. Once more, the path to Russia lay before him. And this time, history would not wait.
Chapter 8. The Prophet Armed. Released from Canadian detention after firm demands from the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky arrived back in Russia on May 4, 1917. The country he returned to felt unbalanced, almost unreal. Power was split down the middle. On one side stood the provisional government, issuing proclamations it could not enforce. On the other stood the Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies, whose resolutions were carried out immediately. Russia was living under two authorities at once, and everyone sensed the arrangement could not last. Trotsky wasted no time choosing sides. From the moment he stepped onto Russian soil, he argued that only the Soviets could carry the revolution forward. He assumed leadership of the Mezhrayontsy, an independent group of several thousand revolutionaries positioned between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Night after night, he spoke at the Circus Moderne, a vast hall where workers crowded in after factory shifts, and soldiers arrived straight from their barracks. They listened in silence, then erupted, not because he offered comfort, but because he gave coherence to the chaos they were living through. In July, Trotsky formally joined the Bolsheviks, just as the provisional government launched its crackdown after the failed July days. Like Lenin, he was accused of being a German agent, the familiar charge hurled at anyone demanding an end to the war.
He was arrested and confined in Kresty prison, where he spent weeks writing and thinking while the revolution outside stalled and trembled. In August, General Lavr Kornilov marched on Petrograd, attempting a military coup. The government panicked. With no forces it could trust, it turned to the very revolutionaries it had imprisoned. The Bolsheviks were released to defend the capital. The would-be conspirators became its defenders. Freed in early September, Trotsky was immediately elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. From that point on, he became the most visible figure of the coming insurrection. While Lenin remained in hiding, Trotsky addressed sailors, soldiers, and delegates daily, transforming abstract ideas into concrete purpose. As head of the Military Revolutionary Committee, he oversaw preparations with careful precision, ensuring that when power was taken, it would appear not as a reckless gamble, but as an orderly transition. On one crucial point, he restrained Lenin's impatience. Lenin wanted the party to seize power outright, in its own name. Trotsky insisted they wait for the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, allowing authority to pass formally to the Soviets themselves. It was a decisive choice. The revolution would present itself not as a coup, but as a transfer of power from one representative body to another. When October 25th arrived, the drama unfolded with surprising calm. Key points in the city were taken almost without resistance. The Winter Palace fell after brief, confused defense.
Ministers were arrested while still debating their next move. Across the river, the Congress of Soviets convened at Smolny, the distant sound of artillery punctuating the speeches. Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries rose in protest, denouncing the Bolshevik action as a crime against democracy, and walked out. Trotsky watched them go, then spoke with icy finality. They were isolated, he said. The historical role was finished. They were leaving not the hall, but history itself. Inside, the remaining delegates voted to transfer all power to the Soviets. At 38, Trotsky stood second only to Lenin in the new revolutionary government. The peasant boy from Yanovka had become the revolution's chief organizer and its sharpest voice, a prophet who now carried a sword. What no one in that hall yet understood was how brief the triumph would be. Victory would harden into siege, and the struggle ahead would no longer be for world revolution, but for survival itself. Chapter 9. Arming the Republic. When the new Council of People's Commissars was formed, Trotsky was first given the post of Foreign Affairs. He made his mark immediately, releasing the secret treaties of the old Tsarist regime and exposing how the Allied powers had planned to divide the world long before the war ended. It was a dramatic gesture, but drama alone could not save the revolution. Russia was bleeding. White armies were gathering on every frontier, and foreign intervention loomed. In March 1918, Lenin reassigned him as Commissar of War. It was less an appointment than a gamble. The task before him bordered on the impossible: to create an army while the country disintegrated into civil war. The old imperial army had vanished almost overnight. Soldiers deserted en masse, returning to their villages with rifles slung over their shoulders. Generals remained, but with no troops to command. Many revolutionaries dreamed of volunteer militias and partisan bands, believing discipline itself to be a relic of oppression. Trotsky rejected this outright. Passion, he argued, could not defeat trained officers, armored trains, and foreign-backed forces. Revolution without organization would be crushed. He built his command around an armored train, which became both symbol and instrument of his authority. For more than 2 years, it moved constantly along the fractured fronts of the Civil War, covering tens of thousands of miles. Inside were telegraph rooms, printing presses, generators, a library, vehicles, and even aircraft for reconnaissance. Wherever the front faltered, the train appeared, bringing orders, speeches, and punishment. His most explosive decision was to enlist tens of thousands of former Tsarist officers as military specialists. The party recoiled. These men were enemies by class and memory. Some had commanded troops that fired on workers in 1905. At Tsaritsyn, future Stalingrad, Stalin and Voroshilov openly defied Trotsky's appointments, executing officers without authorization. Trotsky responded with threats of court-martial, asserting civilian control over the army with iron resolve. To secure loyalty, he introduced the system of political commissars, communist officials assigned to every unit, empowered to countersign orders and monitor commanders. Where surveillance failed, coercion followed. Families of officers were held as hostages. Desertion carried the ultimate penalty. These measures were ruthless, but Trotsky viewed them as mathematical necessities. Without trained leadership, the Red forces would collapse. The test came in August 1918, when White forces captured Kazan. Panic spread through Red ranks. Units broke and fled. Trotsky arrived to scenes of confusion and fear. He acted without hesitation. Deserters were executed publicly, brave soldiers promoted on the spot. When a regiment abandoned its position, both its commander and commissar were tried and shot within hours. Discipline returned as swiftly as terror spread. Within days, the Red Army retook Kazan and seized the enemy's gold reserves. More importantly, they proved they could win. From chaos, Trotsky forged a force that would grow to nearly 3 million soldiers. Workers and peasants were transformed into an army through a mixture of belief, fear, and relentless organization. By 1920, the Whites were defeated. Kolchak in Siberia, Denikin in the south, Yudenich outside Petrograd. The Red Army stood victorious. Yet the victory carried a price. The revolution that had promised emancipation now ruled through conscription, executions, and centralized force. Trotsky had preserved the revolution by militarizing it. The blade he forged saved the new state, but in time, that same blade would be turned against its creator. Chapter 10: Revolution and Conquest. The first great test of the new revolutionary state came not on the battlefield, but at a negotiating table. In early 1918, Trotsky arrived at Brest-Litovsk to lead the Soviet delegation. Across from him sat the representatives of the German and Austro-Hungarian empires, uniforms immaculate, maps already marked with future borders. Trotsky treated the talks less as diplomacy than as a stage. He did not speak to the diplomats so much as past them. His real audience, he believed, was the German working class listening beyond the walls. With deliberate calm, he announced a formula that baffled and infuriated his counterparts. No war, no peace. Russia would demobilize its army, but it would not sign a treaty of conquest. The old language of empire, he insisted, was already obsolete. Revolution was coming, and with it the end of secret deals and carved-up nations. It was a wager on history itself. Strikes were flaring in Berlin and Vienna. Socialist agitation spread through the factories of Central Europe. Why surrender territory, Trotsky reasoned, when the entire imperial order might collapse within weeks? But history did not move on his timetable. The German command lost patience and ordered its armies forward. They advanced almost unopposed, moving through Russian territory as if through abandoned corridors. the illusion shattered overnight. Inside the Bolshevik leadership, the crisis became existential. Lenin argued that survival demanded compromise. The revolution, fragile and exhausted, needed time at any cost. Others, led by Bukharin, called for revolutionary war. Better to fall fighting than to sign a shameful peace. Trotsky stood between them, torn between conviction and calculation. When the vote came, he abstained. By a single margin, Lenin's line prevailed. The treaty was signed. Russia lost Ukraine, the Baltic territories, and vast populations and resources. It was a peace that felt like defeat, accepted only because the alternative seemed worse. The question returned 2 years later, this time at the gates of Europe. In 1920, after repelling Polish forces from Ukraine, the Red Army pushed westward. Warsaw lay ahead. Lenin and most of the leadership believed the moment had come to carry revolution beyond Russia's borders, to ignite Germany through force of arms if necessary. Trotsky objected. Revolution imposed by foreign soldiers, he warned, would not be welcomed as liberation. It would awaken nationalism, not class solidarity. Again, he was overruled. The Red Army marched toward Warsaw, and again, reality answered more harshly than theory. Polish workers rallied not to socialism, but to their nation. The counter-offensive on the Vistula shattered the Red advance. Thousands were killed or captured. The dream of an immediate European revolution dissolved. These failures forced a grim reckoning. The revolution was alone.
Civil war had emptied the cities, silenced factories, and decimated the very working class in whose name the state ruled. Power remained, but its social foundation was dangerously thin. Then came Kronstadt. In March 1921, sailors at the naval fortress near Petrograd, men once hailed as the vanguard of October, rose in revolt. Their demands were stark and unsettling. Free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech for socialists, an end to party privilege. They did not reject the revolution. They accused its leaders of betraying it. Trotsky answered with an ultimatum: lay down your arms, or the fortress would be taken by force. When the sailors refused, Red Army units crossed the frozen Gulf under fire. The assault was brutal and final. Hundreds died. As they fell, many cried out not against the revolution, but for it. Later, Trotsky would describe the decision as a tragic necessity. A surgeon, he said, cutting into living flesh to save a dying body. Yet something irreplaceable was lost on that ice. The revolution survived, but it emerged harder, narrower, and more isolated than before. The age of conquest, of territory, of power, of obedience had begun, and the cost of survival was becoming painfully clear. Chapter 11. The Anathema. When the guns finally fell silent in 1921, the Bolsheviks stood victorious over a devastated land. Russia had survived, but at terrible cost. Cities were hollowed out by hunger. Factories stood idle. The working class, in whose name the revolution ruled, had scattered back to the countryside in search of bread. Lenin himself acknowledged the truth few wished to face. The proletariat was no longer a coherent force. It was dispersed, exhausted, and politically drained. Power remained in the hands of the party, not because society surged behind it, but because nothing else could stand. This quiet crisis, legitimacy ebbing beneath the surface, defined the years that followed. In 1922, Lenin's health began to collapse, A stroke in May slowed him. Another in December nearly silenced him. As his strength faded, a new configuration emerged at the summit of power. Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev formed a compact alliance, bound less by shared vision than by shared fear. All three understood that Trotsky, with his reputation, intellect, and revolutionary prestige, stood closest to Lenin's historical stature. Their objective was simple: prevent him from inheriting authority. Stalin's advantage lay not in ideas, but in position. As General Secretary, a post few had initially taken seriously, he controlled appointments, assignments, and promotions. Quietly, methodically, he filled the party apparatus with loyalists. What appeared to be dull administrative labor was in fact a gradual seizure of power, conducted without speeches or manifestos. From his sick room, Lenin grew increasingly alarmed. Reports from Georgia, where Stalin's allies used coercion and chauvinist pressure against local communists, convinced him that the bureaucracy was hardening into something alien to the revolution's spirit. In late 1922, Lenin proposed an alliance with Trotsky to resist this degeneration. He entrusted him with defending key positions on state planning, foreign trade, and the national question. That winter, Lenin dictated what would later be known as his testament. He assessed his closest comrades with clinical honesty. Of Stalin, he warned that immense power had accumulated in the hands of a man whose temperament made him dangerous. Of Trotsky, he wrote that he was the most capable figure in the leadership, though prone to excessive self-confidence. Days later came the crucial addition. Stalin's rudeness and abuse of authority, Lenin said, had become intolerable. He urged the party to consider removing him from the post of General Secretary. It was a political weapon of enormous force. But before it could be wielded, Lenin suffered his final stroke in March 1923. Speechless and incapacitated, he lingered for months, alive but absent, while others maneuvered around his shadow. Trotsky now faced a choice, and made the one history would judge most harshly. He refused to strike while Lenin lay dying. Attacking rivals, he believed, would be dishonorable. He underestimated Stalin, dismissing him as a bureaucratic nonentity, a colorless functionary incapable of independent leadership. At the 12th Party Congress in April 1923, Trotsky remained silent about the testament, honoring a private agreement not to deploy it openly. His restraint saved his opponents. Zinoviev and Kamenev closed ranks with Stalin, consolidating their control, while Trotsky isolated himself further. When Lenin died in January 1924, the balance had already shifted. Trotsky, ill and convalescing far from Moscow, was misinformed about the date of the funeral. Stalin presided over the ceremonies, presenting himself as Lenin's closest disciple. Trotsky's absence was noted, whispered about, and later weaponized as evidence of arrogance and disloyalty. The testament was read only to selected delegates at the 13th Congress that spring. Zinoviev and Kamenev, men who once feared Stalin most, now defended him, insisting his faults could be corrected. The warning was buried. The moment passed. By January 1925, the process was complete. Trotsky was removed from his last major post, Commissar of War. The architect of the Red Army, the organizer of October, the revolution's most brilliant orator, was pushed aside through votes, procedures, and resolutions. No dramatic arrest, no public trial, just erasure. The sword of the revolution was taken from his hand. He was left with words alone, and even those, he would soon discover, were no longer safe. Chapter 12. The Decisive Contest. With Lenin gone for good, the struggle he had tried to restrain burst fully into the open. By late 1923, Soviet Russia was entering a new crisis, not of armies or borders, but of economics and power. Industrial goods grew ever more expensive, while agricultural prices collapsed. The graph of prices opened like a pair of shears, threatening to sever the fragile alliance between workers and peasants. It was called the Scissors Crisis, and it exposed how little direction the ruling leadership truly had. The triumvirate responded with resolutions and slogans, but no coherent remedy. Unease spread through the party. In October 1923, 46 prominent Bolsheviks signed a declaration condemning economic mismanagement and the steady suffocation of inner-party democracy. It was an extraordinary act of defiance. From this moment, the left opposition took shape. Trotsky joined without hesitation. His essays soon formed a single polemical work, The New Course. Written in a calm but cutting tone, it argued that the party was being transformed from a living organism into an administrative hierarchy. Debate was giving way to fear. Appointed secretaries, loyal not to ideas but to the apparatus, now ruled local organizations. Trotsky warned that bureaucratism was not merely a moral failing, it was a social process, born from the widening gap between the party and the masses in whose name it governed. He appealed especially to the youth. Revolutions, he reminded them, either renew themselves or ossify. The response was immediate. In Moscow party cells, in universities and factories, the opposition's arguments carried weight. Young workers and students spoke openly of stagnation and betrayal. But persuasion was no longer enough. Real power lay elsewhere. The party machine controlled conference delegations, committee appointments, and voting procedures. Trotsky himself was repeatedly sidelined by sudden illnesses, mysterious fevers that seemed to strike whenever decisive meetings approached. The apparatus moved with cold efficiency. In January 1924, a party conference formally condemned the opposition for petty bourgeois deviation from Leninism. The verdict was delivered just weeks before Lenin's death, cloaked in his authority. Later that year, Trotsky published Lessons of October, a reflective analysis of the 1917 revolution. Almost in passing, he mentioned an inconvenient historical truth. Zinoviev and Kamenev had opposed Lenin's call for insurrection and had even made their dissent public. The reaction was explosive. The triumvirate launched an all-out ideological counter-offensive. Thus began the campaign against Trotskyism. His entire past was exhumed, distorted, and reassembled into a hostile myth. Every disagreement before 1917 became proof of treachery. Quotations were torn from context or invented outright. Positions he had never held were attributed to him with absolute confidence. A fictional Trotsky, anti-Leninist, elitist, enemy of the party, was constructed and endlessly repeated until it replaced memory itself. Many party members came to despise a man they had never actually read. At the same time, Stalin introduced a new doctrine: socialism in one country. The Soviet Union, he argued, could build a complete socialist society on its own, without waiting for revolution abroad. To an exhausted population, it sounded like relief. To Trotsky, it was abandonment. The revolution, he insisted, had always been international, or it was nothing. This new theory offered permission to retreat from history's most dangerous promise. Even the triumvirate could not hold. By 1925, Zinoviev and Kamenev, entrenched in Leningrad, grew alarmed at Stalin's swelling power. Bukharin's influence rose on the right, advocating concessions to the peasantry as wealth concentrated in the countryside. Workers' wages stagnated. Bureaucrats prospered. The revolution was slowly turning inside out. In April 1926, something unthinkable occurred. Zinoviev and Kamenev approached Trotsky. They admitted what he had long known. The anti-Trotsky campaign had been cynical theatre. Stalin, once their instrument, had become their master. The true danger, Kamenev confessed in private, was the total fusion of party and state, an apparatus that answered only to itself, embodied now in Stalin. From this belated reckoning emerged the united opposition. Former enemies joined forces against a common threat. It was a dramatic convergence, born of necessity rather than trust. But history had already tilted. Stalin controlled the machinery controlled the party, and the party controlled the state. The decisive contest had begun, but its outcome was no longer in doubt.
Chapter 13. The Prophet Outcast. Stripped of the war commissariat, Trotsky drifted to the margins of official life. He was assigned technical and economic work, industrial planning, electrification, the scientific organization of labor. It was a quiet demotion, meant to reduce him from a revolutionary force to a specialist. He accepted the posts, but not the silence. During these years he wrote relentlessly, turning his gaze outward as his enemies worked to erase him at home. In Where is Britain Going?, he traced the slow decline of the old empire and the rise of American power with unsettling accuracy. He was thinking about the future, even as his name vanished from photographs, textbooks, and official memory. The united opposition fought on for more than a year under conditions designed to crush it. Their platform called for rapid industrialization, funded by taxing the kulaks, a revival of party democracy, and rejection of the doctrine of socialism in one country. Each attempt to speak to party members was obstructed. Meetings dissolved into organized chaos, whistles, chants, staged outrage. Pamphlets were seized before they could circulate. Supporters lost jobs, scholarships, apartments. The party had learned new methods, and it was using them against its own. The struggle over China became the defining confrontation. In 1925 to 1927, Stalin insisted that Chinese communists subordinate themselves to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist movement, promising protection through alliance. Trotsky warned that it would end in catastrophe. A bourgeois nationalist, he argued, would always turn on workers once power was within reach. In April 1927, the warning proved prophetic. Chiang ordered the massacre of communists in Shanghai. Thousands were killed in days. While the blood was still fresh, the Soviet leadership suppressed the news. That summer, Trotsky delivered his last major speech before the Central Committee. He spoke over jeers and interruptions, his words cutting through the noise with cold clarity. The methods now being used against the opposition, he said, were the very methods once employed by the class enemy against the Bolsheviks. Comrades who had lived through 3 revolutions were being expelled like criminals. He drew a final line. Loyalty to the socialist fatherland, yes, but not to a bureaucratic course that strangled the revolution's soul. The reprisals followed swiftly. In October 1927, he was removed from the Central Committee. On the 10th anniversary of October, oppositionists attempted peaceful demonstrations. police broke them apart. Hundreds were arrested. Those who displayed Trotsky's portrait were beaten in the streets. Within weeks, Trotsky and Zinoviev were expelled from the party itself. Zinoviev capitulated almost immediately, publicly confessing errors, begging for readmission. Others followed. Outside the party, many felt they ceased to exist. Trotsky did not recant. In January 1928, security agents arrived at his Moscow apartment and placed him on a train bound for Alma-Ata, near the Chinese border, thousands of kilometers from the capital. It was meant to isolate him. Instead, exile altered his methods. With his son, Lev Sedov, he built a clandestine network linking oppositionists scattered across Siberia. Letters flowed in and out, hundreds in months. Political analyses, strategic directives, fragments of a banned conversation kept alive across impossible distances. From a remote town of searing summers and brutal winters, he led what amounted to a party in shadow, sustaining morale among the defeated. In 1928, events seemed to turn in his favor. Grain shortages triggered peasant resistance, and Stalin abruptly reversed course, adopting forced industrialization and collectivization, policies long advocated by the opposition. Some believed this was victory at last. Trotsky was not deceived. These measures, imposed without democracy and enforced through terror, would not build socialism, but a distorted parody of it, productive, ruthless, and profoundly alienated from the working class. The final blow came swiftly. In January 1929, Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union altogether. He was placed on a ship and sent into permanent exile. The revolution's most eloquent voice was cast beyond its borders, never to return. The prophet had been driven out, not because he was wrong, but because he would not stop reminding those in power what the revolution had once promised to be. Chapter 14. The Black Night Descends. In January 1929, the order was carried out without ceremony. Trotsky was expelled from the Soviet Union, stripped of citizenship, escorted under guard to the frontier, and pushed beyond the borders of the state he had helped to create. There was no trial, no appeal, only silence. In February, he arrived in Constantinople and soon settled on Principo, a quiet island in the Sea of Marmara. From this small, windswept place, far from the centers of power, he prepared for what he believed would be the final struggle of his life. Trotsky still thought Stalinism was a temporary deformation, a bureaucratic illness history would eventually cure. He did not yet speak of founding a new international. Instead, he organized the International Left Opposition, a current meant to reform the communist movement from within. His weapons were no longer armies or decrees, but manuscripts. On Principo, he wrote My Life, his autobiography, and his monumental History of the Russian Revolution, reconstructing the events others were now erasing. The opposition's bulletin, printed in exile, was smuggled back into the Soviet Union, passed from hand to hand until the pages disintegrated. As he wrote, the world darkened. In the Soviet countryside, Stalin launched forced collectivization, tearing millions of peasants from their land. Resistance was met with terror. Famine followed, vast and largely hidden, swallowing entire regions. At the same time, the Wall Street crash of 1929 plunged the capitalist world into depression. Factories closed, unemployment soared. Fear and rage spread across continents. Nowhere was the danger clearer than in Germany. By 1930, the Nazi Party had surged from the fringes to become a mass force. Trotsky watched with growing alarm. From exile, he issued warning after warning to the German communists. Unite with the Social Democrats, form a workers' front, stop Hitler before it is too late. Together, he argued, they commanded millions of votes and the loyalty of the organized working class. Divided, they would be crushed. But the Communist International, following Moscow's line, dismissed these appeals. Social Democrats were branded social fascists, enemies no different from the Nazis themselves. Some even claimed that a fascist victory would hasten revolution. Trotsky answered with grim clarity. If fascism comes to power, he wrote, it will not open the road to socialism. It will smash the workers' movement, bone and spine alike. Time was running out. In January 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. Within weeks, the German labor movement, the strongest in Europe, was destroyed without a single decisive battle. Trade unions were dissolved, parties were banned, leaders were imprisoned or sent to camps. The Communist International, which had refused to fight, now found itself unable even to protest. For Trotsky, this was the final verdict. The Third International was finished.
A new one would have to be built. That same winter, personal tragedy struck with devastating force. His daughter Zinaida, trapped in Berlin, denied Soviet citizenship, separated from her child, and weakened by illness and despair, took her own life. She had written to him, pleading for help. He could do nothing. No passport, no influence, no means to save her. From exile, he understood her death not as an accident, but as another consequence of political annihilation. The losses continued. In the Soviet Union, former oppositionists disappeared into camps and prisons. Comrades from the underground, from the Civil War, from the first days of the revolution, vanished into the expanding gulag. Another daughter had already died of tuberculosis. His son, who had avoided politics altogether, would later be arrested and executed. An entire generation was being erased. From his island refuge, Trotsky could only watch and write. The night was closing in, over Europe, over Russia, over his own family. Yet he continued, night after night, recording events, issuing warnings, tracing the logic of catastrophe. These were no longer appeals meant to persuade those in power. They were messages cast forward in time, written for a future that might one day ask how the world had slipped so quietly into darkness. Chapter 15. A Planet Without a Visa. By 1933, exile had become a dead end. With Hitler entrenched in power and the Communist International, in Trotsky's eyes, politically bankrupt, he sought to leave Turkey for the heart of Europe, where events were moving fastest. In July, France's radical government granted him entry. It was an act of principle that startled a continent already bending toward authoritarianism. Trotsky settled first near Roya, then in Barbizon, and began work on a vast biography of Lenin, determined to preserve a record that was being systematically destroyed. But Europe would not allow silence. History was accelerating. In February 1934, the Stavisky affair detonated in Paris, a corruption scandal that spilled into the streets as far-right leagues marched on parliament. To Trotsky, the pattern was unmistakable. Democracies, he argued, collapsed in stages. Scandal, paralysis, then mobilized reaction. He urged his small French following to enter the Socialist Party, to fight within the mass organizations rather than remain isolated. This French turn enraged doctrinaire revolutionaries who preferred ideological purity to influence, even if it meant political irrelevance. Pressure closed in quickly. A minor police incident exposed his location. The press pounced. Stalinist papers denounced him as a fascist conspirator. Fascist papers branded him a Jewish Bolshevik terrorist. Trotsky noted bitterly in his diary that his life had become a perfect target, rich enough to feed every fantasy.
The hatred itself, he observed, was presented as proof of guilt. Why else, readers were invited to ask, would so many enemies agree? Harassed by police and cut off from supporters, Trotsky and Natalia moved through remote alpine villages, never staying long, always watched. Then, in December 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated in Leningrad. Stalin's response was immediate and ferocious. Arrests multiplied, executions followed. From isolation, Trotsky understood what was beginning. This was not a purge, but the preparation for a colossal political fabrication, the rewriting of an entire revolutionary generation as traitors. In June 1935, France expelled him. The government of Pierre Laval, seeking an alliance with Stalin against Hitler, sacrificed asylum to diplomacy. Norway's Labour government offered refuge, socialists extending protection to one of socialism's founders. Yet even there, safety proved fragile. When the first Moscow show trial opened in August 1936, with former comrades confessing to absurd plots under torture, Soviet pressure intensified. Norway placed Trotsky under house arrest, banned him from commenting on current events, and posted guards around his home. A workers' government had silenced the man who had built the Red Army, while the accused were being destroyed thousands of kilometers away. The Norwegian authorities searched desperately for a place to send him. None could be found. Britain, France, the United States, all refused. The world's democracies, speaking endlessly of liberty, closed their borders to a stateless revolutionary. Only Mexico opened its doors. President Lázaro Cárdenas, in the midst of land reform and oil nationalization, understood the cost of defying powerful forces. In January 1937, Trotsky arrived in Mexico as the second Moscow trial unfolded, escalating the accusations into fantasy, sabotage, poisoning, plans to restore capitalism. Against an empire of lies, he had only one defense: facts. He accepted John Dewey's proposal to convene an independent international commission. In Diego Rivera's Blue House in Coyoacán, Trotsky would answer every charge, document every claim, and turn the tables. The hunter had granted his prey one last hearing. It would be Trotsky's final great stand, not merely for his own name, but for the possibility of historical truth in an age determined to erase it.
Chapter 16. The Counter-Trial in Coyoacán. In April 1937, a quiet courtyard in Coyoacán, Mexico, became the unlikely stage for one of the 20th century's strangest trials. Inside Diego Rivera's Blue House, an independent commission assembled to examine the charges hurled from Moscow across oceans and borders. For 13 sessions, the world's accusations met one man. Leon Trotsky stood before the commission not as a supplicant, but as a witness to history. John Dewey, the renowned American philosopher, presided. Around him sat journalists, scholars, skeptics, none bound by loyalty to Trotsky, many openly doubtful. They had come to test the claims of the Moscow trials, that Trotsky had conspired with Hitler, directed sabotage from thousands of miles away, and met condemned men in places that seemed to dissolve upon inspection. For days, the questioning was relentless. Dates, addresses, letters, movements, nothing was spared. Trotsky answered calmly, methodically, as if lecturing rather than defending himself. Documents piled up, passports stamped in the wrong countries, telegrams contradicting confessions, newspaper reports fixing him in one city while prosecutors placed him in another. The alleged meeting at Copenhagen's Hotel Bristol collapsed When it emerged, the hotel had been demolished years earlier. A secret journey to Norway vanished when officials confirmed he had never crossed the border. One by one, the accusations unraveled under the quiet weight of evidence. When his turn came to speak freely, Trotsky spoke for 5.5 hours. It was not an appeal for sympathy. It was an anatomy of power. The confessions in Moscow, he argued, were not aberrations, but instruments. Stalin required total obedience, and obedience required the destruction of memory itself. The old Bolsheviks had to denounce their own lives to justify their erasure. Terror needed ritual. Lies needed voices. He ended not with bitterness, but belief. Despite prisons, exile, and death closing in, he affirmed his faith in reason, in truth, in human solidarity. The same faith he claimed to have carried into workers' quarters as a teenager. It was the language of conviction spoken softly, almost gently, in a room far from the shouting halls of Moscow. Months later, the commission issued its verdict: not guilty. Complete vindication before world opinion. But world opinion held no jurisdiction in Stalin's state. In February 1938, the final Moscow trial opened. Bukharin and the remnants of the right opposition confessed to impossible crimes. The machinery rolled on. Then came a blow more personal than politics. Trotsky's son, Lev Sedov, his closest collaborator and lifeline to the outside world, died suddenly in a Paris hospital after what should have been routine surgery. No explanation satisfied Trotsky. He understood the message. Another thread cut. By then, nearly all were gone. One daughter dead, another driven to suicide. One son vanished into the camps. Now Lev. The circle tightened. Yet even then, Trotsky pressed forward. In September 1938, against every practical calculation, he proclaimed the founding of the Fourth International. 40 delegates met in secrecy near Paris, so few they could fit into a single room. Against Stalin's empire, Hitler's armies, and a collapsing capitalist world, they declared themselves the continuation of revolutionary Marxism. Whether it was courage or illusion hardly mattered anymore. It was an act of defiance against silence. Back in Mexico, Trotsky moved to a new house on Avenida Vienna, turning it into a fortress. High walls, steel doors, guards posted day and night. He knew the pattern too well to expect mercy. Only timing remained uncertain. He wrote constantly, articles, letters, polemics, his unfinished biography of Stalin. Each sentence was composed with the awareness that it might be the last. History, he believed, moved slowly, but death did not. And so, surrounded by walls and shadows, Leon Trotsky continued to write, calmly, deliberately, while the night drew closer. Chapter 17. The Black Night and the Ice Axe. In the early hours of May 24th, 1940, the fortress on Avenida Vienna was shattered by gunfire. Just before dawn, a command of armed men breached the walls and unleashed a storm of bullets into the house. Machine gun fire tore through doors and plaster, ripping into Leon Trotsky's bedroom. More than 300 rounds struck the walls where he had been sleeping minutes before. Trotsky and Natalia Sedova survived by instinct and chance, throwing themselves flat beneath the bed as fragments of masonry and glass rained down. Even the room of their young grandson was swept with bullets. When silence finally returned, the attackers fled. No one inside the house was dead. By morning, Trotsky spoke calmly to reporters. Stalin had failed, he said, this time. But he understood the pattern too well to believe the danger had passed.
A second attempt would not be so clumsy. The real assassin, he sensed, would not come shouting through the gate. That assassin had already arrived. For months, a quiet young man calling himself Jacques Mornard, later Frank Jackson, had been moving carefully through Trotsky's world. He presented himself as the apolitical companion of an American sympathizer, awkward, self-effacing, mildly annoyed by revolutionary arguments rather than driven by them. He brought small gifts, played with the rabbits in the garden, spoke politely to Natalia. He blended into routine. Suspicion faded. Through the summer of 1940, Trotsky worked with urgency, aware that time was narrowing. He labored over his unfinished biography of Stalin, dissecting the rise of the man who had destroyed the revolution from within. At the same time, he fought his final theoretical battles, arguing with followers abroad over the nature of the Soviet Union. Despite purges, terror, and the pact with Hitler, he maintained that October's social foundations still existed beneath bureaucratic rule. In any war between the USSR and imperialism, he insisted, revolutionaries must defend it, critically, without illusions, but firmly. On the afternoon of August 20th, Jackson arrived, as he often had before. He asked Trotsky to review a short article. Nothing seemed unusual. Trotsky led him into the study, sat at his desk, and began reading. The text was confused, poorly argued, but Trotsky read on, perhaps out of courtesy. Behind him, Jackson remained standing, wearing a raincoat despite the heat. Concealed beneath the coat was an ice axe, stolen from a mountaineering shop. The blow came suddenly, from behind. Intended to kill instantly, it struck at an angle, sinking into Trotsky's skull, but failing to crush it. A terrible cry filled the room. Witnesses would later say it seemed to suspend time itself. Trotsky did not collapse. He turned, grappled with his attacker, bit his hand, and fought to prevent a second strike. Guards rushed in to find him still standing, blood streaming down his face.
As they seized Jackson, Trotsky spoke with clarity and force. "Do not kill him," he said. "He must speak." Even in that moment, he thought as a chronicler, not a victim. They carried him to his bed. Doctors worked through the night while Natalia held his hand. His consciousness faded and returned, but his mind remained lucid. He dictated his final message. He was dying from the blow of a political assassin. He affirmed his certainty in the future victory of the cause he had defended all his life. He urged his comrades to go forward. Leon Trotsky died the following evening, August 21st, 1940. Months earlier, he had written his own epitaph. "Life is beautiful," he had said. "Let future generations cleanse it of cruelty and violence and enjoy it fully." The boy born on the Ukrainian steppe, who once sought only to win arguments, died still believing in reason, in humanity, and in a future beyond tyranny, even as the world around him burned in the war he had long foreseen. The voice was silenced. The words remained. History would decide whether they were prophecy or warning. Epilogue. The afterlife of a prophet. Leon Trotsky died convinced that time, not power, would deliver the final verdict. In the years after his murder, that faith seemed naive. Stalin's state did not merely kill him, it erased him. His image was cut from photographs, his books removed from libraries, his name turned into a crime. For a generation inside the Soviet Union, to speak of Trotsky was to invite arrest, exile, or worse. History itself appeared to have been rewritten without him. And yet history has a longer memory than regimes. Stalin's empire eventually collapsed. Statues fell, archives opened, silences broke. Trotsky did not return as a saint or a consensus figure, but as something far more durable. A problem. A figure argued over, reread, and re-examined across continents. From university seminars to political movements, from Mexico City to Mumbai, his ideas refuse to stay buried. Many of his immediate hopes failed. The Fourth International never became a mass force. The Soviet Union survived for decades without the political revolution he believed inevitable. Capitalism endured crises that he thought might end it. But beneath those failed predictions lay deeper insights that continue to unsettle. Trotsky's theory of uneven and combined development, first forged to explain Russia's strange path into modernity, has found new life well beyond Marxist politics. Scholars of international relations and global history now use it to explain why modern societies develop through contradiction rather than sequence. Why advanced technology so often coexists with extreme inequality, archaic labor, and political volatility. The world Trotsky tried to understand did not disappear. It expanded. He also grasped, earlier than most, how revolutions can hollow themselves out. His analysis of bureaucratic degeneration, the slow substitution of party for class, leadership for party, and finally, one man for all, reads less like polemic and more like diagnosis, not only of Stalinism, but of revolutionary failures across the 20th century and beyond. He understood how the language of liberation can mask new forms of domination. At the same time, his legacy is not clean. Trotsky never fully resolved his own role in creating the machinery that later crushed him. The militarization of labor, the normalization of coercion, the suppression of Kronstadt. These questions linger uncomfortably. Revolutionary violence, even when justified by necessity, reshapes those who wield it. Perhaps that is why Trotsky still matters. Not because he offers simple answers, but because he refused comforting illusions. Neither empire nor compromise, neither resignation nor blind faith. Only the insistence that humanity could, under the right conditions, rise above its inherited limits. As our own world faces retreating democracy, widening inequality, and crises that demand transformation without clear maps, Trotsky's ghost returns, not as a guide, but as a challenge. How does change happen without devouring itself? Who controls it? And at what cost? If you've stayed with this story to the end, thank you. If this series helped you think, question, or simply drift into history before sleep, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps these quiet stories find others who need them. And let us know in the comments, was Trotsky ultimately a visionary, a tragic figure, or both? History has not finished arguing with him yet.